Hi, Heather. Good morning. We're going to be talking about our dedicated playground space, how it came to be, what it's for. We're going to speak to some parents and hear from them, and also we have people in our congregation who work with and know a whole lot more about brain development than I do, and so they're going to be speaking with us as well. This idea really got started with Chris Kent, who's a former president of the congregation. He's ill this morning, otherwise he would be here speaking himself. So in lieu of him, we have our current congregational president who's going to tell you how he bugged her over and over again into making this a reality. So here's Diane.
So I just have had a couple of minutes to think about that. And if I recall, Kent approached me some months ago about a service they had attended at another church and this play area that the young children had, and how that was such a dynamic part of the service. The children were, were right there in the service, and how he thought that was something that we should do. I just kind of looked at him like, bring the kids out front in church. So then we talked about it a bit, and I said, well, we'll look at it. We'll think about that. We have a lot of things that we're doing, and so we will certainly put that on our list. And we did talk about it in council, and then, several more months passed by, and he asked me again, how are we doing on that? And I said, we are working on that. That children's ministry was an area that we were wanting to improve and work on, and I said, so we are looking at it. And so it progressed, and time went on, and here we are. So we didn't let it go.
The timing for all of this was pretty serendipitous as well, because Pastor Karen looked at the annual report and saw how many children we had baptized in the previous year, and she said, so what happens after you baptize kids at St. Matthew's? Like, what's next? Should I just kind of tell these people to show up again when their kids are old enough to be in Sunday school? I was like, oh. So that was a pretty convicting question, and it came right along at the same time as Chris Kent brought this idea forward. And some of the people I wanted you to hear from this morning are people who are in the trenches of parenthood. How many of you raised children and brought even small children with you to church on Sunday mornings? Okay. On a scale of 1 to 10, how much of the service were you able to listen to? Like 10, I got every word. It was very worshipful and fulfilling. Okay. So I'm getting a whole range of numbers, including like below 1, 0, right? So most people in this room know from experience, or I'm sure could imagine, how hard it is to try and bring small kids to worship. And so I wanted you to hear from somebody who's bringing 3 small kids to worship every Sunday, and that is Laura McCarthy. Would you come up? Do you all know Laura McCarthy?
Yay!
Yay!
So yes, I'm Laura McCarthy. My husband Dan and I joined the church before we got married here, and now quickly have 3 small children, so now 5, 3, and 1. And we've really, we've also since moved to Germantown, so we make the trek here every weekend, and we bring our 3 young children. And it's been a challenge to say the least. And every week I question, like, is this just what young children are like? Or is it our parenting? Is it a combination? Like, what can we do? And it's been really frustrating. And we had a meeting a few months ago with Chris Kent, who has been spearheading this. And, you know, they just brought me and my husband and another family in as, you know, what are people's thoughts? And it was actually, I think, after a particularly hard Sunday where we chased people around, and again, it was not fulfilling for me or my husband to be here, and I feel like I did a lot of complaining, but it came from a place of wanting to be able to enjoy the service and needing that fulfillment in my life weekly and all those things. So we said, you know, we'll try anything. At this point, like, we're venturing here from Germantown. Typically what was ending up happening is that I would sit and try to enjoy the service with maybe our youngest, while my husband brought our 2 older boys to the nursery, so then he gets nothing out of, you know, besides trying to maybe catch a few words on the little TV down there. We're definitely not doing it together as a family. It was more causing, like, fights instead of, you know, the joy after being at church on Sunday and the peace. It was like, why do we even come here and do this? It's just been a mess for us. So when Chris brought it up, I said, you know, I'm not necessarily expecting this to be perfect for our family, but at this point, I'm willing to try anything. And he really had, you know, strong feelings, had seen it in action, which I personally hadn't been to a church where the program was in place, but I'm like, we'll definitely try it. And now it's only been 2 Sundays, and I can't say it's been perfect either, but I think it will be a learning experience for the congregation, for certainly our children, like my husband and I as well. But really just trying to, I know Chris feels strongly too, like really want to have the children there and want them to get to experience worship and to ultimately grow into that relationship where you want to be at church, not just something that you're forced to be at. So hoping that it's a good experience and we're learning right along with everyone else, and I'm sure there'll be things we learn work and work less well, and we're trying to be patient with ourselves and our family. And I don't know a lot about it, but we're just really grateful that the congregation's giving us an opportunity to try something that at least allows our family to be in one place, attempting to be involved in the service without feeling like outcast to the back or a room. And yes, so we're excited for it, hopeful, and we'll see where it goes.
What makes you keep coming back on Sunday morning, especially when it's really hard?
I mean, my husband and I both grew up going to church and, you know, had those experiences. We want to raise our kids more than, you know, that it's not just we force them to go to church, but want them to really, you know Jesus and be able to have this as something meaningful to themselves. And I guess we do just keep coming, hoping that, you know, we see a light at the end of the tunnel with some families with older children, and like we'll get there. So I guess we're just kind of biding our time as we walked around with kids or took them to the nursery. But I think if we could find, like, we want to be able to come back weekly and have it be meaningful for them too. I guess they don't feel called to do it. So we're trying. I don't know if I have a better answer than that. I don't know. Yes. I'm happy to answer questions about our family.
When my kids were little, I was a stay-at-home mom, and my husband was a pastor in Waukesha, which meant that he was never available to help with childcare on Sunday mornings. And I had to try and wrangle both of them in the pews. And I every week wondered, like, why am I doing this? Like, they're not getting anything out of it. I'm not getting anything out of it. And so what happens is that I'm like parenting, but in a fishbowl, right? Like, and in a situation where I have to keep them quiet, right? And like contained. And I'm the pastor's wife, right? Like, everybody knows who I am. Everybody knows who my kids are. And if they're behaving poorly, like, everybody's gonna see it. And so I made my unhappiness known often, that this is what I had to do. there was a nursery. My kids didn't like to go to the nursery. They wanted to be with me. And I'm not sure how you learn how to be in worship without being in worship, right? So that this comes from a part of my experience too, and my frustration of trying to figure out how to make this work, and really kind of longing for some kind of support. I felt judged a whole lot, and probably people weren't meaning to do that, right? Like church people typically are pretty nice people, Lutherans especially. But you know, my kid would make a noise and they'd look at me, right? And it was hard not to feel judged. And I'd heard lots of stories about how, like, well, when my kids were little, they sat in the pew with their dresses on and like didn't make a noise, right? I don't know if that's true or not. I find it hard to believe, but my kids weren't those kids. They weren't just gonna like sit there. So I wanted, part of this journey that's been going on behind the scenes is learning a little bit about brain development, which is not my area of expertise. But we do have people in the congregation who are experts in this and who work with kids all the time and understand way more about that than I understand. Because a playground is not a nursery that has been transplanted to the sanctuary, right? The nursery is something else entirely. A playground is not, is meant to be different than a place to just kind of let kids blow off steam or be loud or go if they're in a bad mood or they're crying. A playground's different, and so I wanted to be able to explain the difference, but I can't explain the difference. So we have a couple people here who are way smarter than I am, including Laura Crave. Do you go by Stotts now?
Oh, sure.
I didn't know if you changed your name.
Yeah.
Okay.
I have. I'm just not used to it
You're
yet.
just Laura Crave Stotts? Laura Crave Stotts. Laura Stotts.
I'll respond to anything.
Okay. So come on up, tell us what you do, and tell us something about how kids' brains work.
Yeah. So yes, I am Laura, formerly Crave, now Stotts. I have spent a lot of my life, I'm not super old, but I've spent a lot of my life so far in school learning about psychology, sociology, and social work. And I've spent about 7 years now in various positions working with kids and families to help them understand how their family might be able to parent and function in a healthy way that supports their kids' well-being and success for the future. And I was thinking about all of the years of information that I've taken in, and how do we wrap that up into a neat package that explains why we have a playground. And I thought back to last week when we started in the beginning of the Bible, talking about creation. And God created humans, and it was good. And today, we know more about the human brain and body than we ever have at any other point in history. And I think that is incredibly exciting because we can use all of that knowledge, all of that information, so that we can create the best environment for kids and for families to not only come and sit and worship, but to learn about Jesus and to truly experience the Christian community. So when we have our tiny little brains, right, babies are born, and they have a small piece of all of the brain power that they will need in their life. They start off with a foundation. Those main pieces of foundation are their sensory experiences. So sight, sound, smell, touch, am I missing? Taste, there we go. I'm putting myself on the spot already. So those are the things that tiny babies start off with. And then in the first few years of life, they do more growing than they will throughout the rest of their life. So immediately they start taking in the world with those senses. So when we have young people that come into church, that is what they're using, are those 5 senses to be able to learn from their experiences. And over time, they'll start adding to those abilities. They start gaining some language. They might start making sounds back to you. And it's really through the interaction that all of those pieces grow. You may have found yourself when a baby is babbling, kind of going, la, 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 you do it back to them. And that's how their brains are learning. It's through a process called serve and return. It's interaction. So when I think about how do we teach little bitties, growing brains about Jesus, about faith, it's through some of those same experiences. For our young people, it's probably not going to be sitting quietly in a service and listening. That's one of our senses. They maybe can see if they're up in the front. They maybe can smell things. There's not a lot of smells in church. I grew up going to a Catholic school, so we had some smells. There was incense, like there was a lot going on there. But if we're thinking about the most effective ways to help people learn and grow, based on how God created our brains, we want to be taking those things into mind. So when I think about a playground, it's an opportunity for all of the senses to be engaged. It's an opportunity for parents or caregivers or the rest of us in the congregation surrounding that area to do some interaction. Today, a crayon rolled behind me in church, and I had the opportunity to pick that crayon up and interact with a child. So it's not all the way up to just a parent or a caregiver, but we all have this really neat community of Christ that we can help young people grow in. So I'm going to make a comparison to building. I mentioned that brains are kind of built up. Has anybody ever built a house or a shed or a structure? Okay. So when you have your blueprint laid out, you have your contractor hired, maybe you're doing the work yourself, what is your first step in building?
Foundation.
Foundation. Okay, so we lay our foundation. We have our young people who are have their senses, their 5 senses, that's their foundation. When you're building up the structure, what's the next thing that you do?
Frame. Walls.
Framing, the walls, absolutely. Why don't we put the roof on top of the foundation?
Short sight.
It doesn't do us any good, right? That just doesn't make sense. So we want to build up those frames. And that's what we're doing by relying on what's already laid to go to our next step. So the next step I mentioned is some of those language skills. Young people starting to interact with each other. They do some trial and error. They might learn from the other people around them. And that's how we start building up their skills, their abilities, their interactions. And then finally we have the roof, is that higher level functioning, as we call it. It happens up in your prefrontal cortex, if you're really into the brain, where you will be able to start thinking and planning and reasoning, do self-regulation. That's the part of our brain that tells me if I scream in church, everyone is going to turn and look at me and it's going to be disruptive. But that part of our brain, the roof, takes a while to come in. So I mentioned the first 3 or 5 years is really a lot of our brain growth and development, but it can take up to age 25 for that prefrontal cortex, for all of that higher level executive functioning to be really effective and really efficient. So to me, this is about what we have as expectations for our kids. And all kids are different. I was a child who got my hair curled and put a dress on and was sat in the pew, and that worked for a little bit. But all of our kids are different. So we know typically these are the expectations that we might have for kids. There are going to be some who don't fall into that realm, and they might need more or less support during services or during worship. But when we use what we know about kids and what we can expect from them, then I think we have this opportunity as a church community to support the growth of young people. I have a lot more I can say about brains, but I want to pause and see if there are questions, or is there someone else that's coming up?
You get a big chunk of this show.
Oh, cool. Okay. Well, let's start with what questions you have so far, and then I can keep building on the foundation if you would like to know more.
I don't really have a question about what you're saying, but we've been gone the past couple weeks. Just curious if anyone has said anything like this during service at the beginning, because that would be so helpful for people who aren't here to understand what you're saying. I mean, obviously very condensed, but like you're making some excellent, amazing points and really educating everyone. I think everyone needs to hear that.
I agree.
So, yeah.
There, so Sonia can help me, but there's been an article in The Voice, there's been stuff in the bulletins and in the weekly emails, and there's even some signage out. So there have been ways we've been trying to get the word out, but you have to be one of the people who like reads the newsletter or
And I mean,
opens your emails and
Yeah, I have seen that stuff, but I mean, just some of this is so like meaty and good and informative, and like this is really why we're doing it. You know, I mean, do you know, and that can't come across in necessarily a voice article or an email, you know, if you have a person stand. I don't know, I just think it would
Laura,
really
are you available for the next several Sundays?
I would love to share more. This is something that, as a quick antidote, I was at the beach with my husband for Labor Day, and a young person came up and really wanted to use our tubes. And he and I have different understanding about child development. And so I was like, yeah, sure, this kid is about to learn about tubes, he's learning about swimming. And my husband was like, we are having a nice time here. Like, why are you inviting this child to play with us now? And I think it's because we all, as society, have, like I said, an amazing opportunity to invest in our neighbors, in our friends, in people's well-being. And so that's what I hope for our St. Matthew's community as we talk about welcoming all. What does that mean? And this morning I was thinking about other times in history where it has been suggested that it is better for groups of people to be in a separate place or in the back of somewhere so that they don't disrupt the majority and how the majority feels or strong voices feel in the community. And I would love for us to move as far away from that as possible and really create spaces where it's clear to our young people that not only are they welcome, but that we are going to accommodate their learning and their growth and their participation. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, have we thought about kids with like disabilities and even severe disabilities? Because that's gonna even distance us further from quiet and order, so.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. I think it is worth having conversation about. Another piece of brains that I'm interested in is my own brain, and I have historically had a hard time with noise. I cannot study or read anything if there are other voices going on. It's something that I have had to exercise in my own brain to be able to sit in a place that has disruption and has loud And so I would challenge us, if you find yourself in that realm, as we're talking about brain development, that your brain can grow too. And that you can teach your brain, exercise your brain in new ways, so that you might be able to take in sound, but it's not a disruption to you. Or you might be able to notice something, but then return to where your attention was before. Because although we, again, first 3 or 5 years, so much growth is happening, but our brains grow and can change forever. Yeah, go ahead.
The interior architecture of the church makes a huge difference. Based on experience in our past church, the chancel contained the choir, the organ and its pipes, the organist, and of course the lectern. And all of these things were in that one central spot. And our children sat with us from infant on in the second row, and our theory was there is so much going on. The closer they are to the action, the more interested they will be, and there will be fewer, as we would say, disruptions and problems, and it proved to be the case. Now here that's a little more difficult. At our past church, the architecture just, it was not designed that way, but it just worked. And we saw that for others too.
Yeah, that's a great point. Because we can not only change how we interact, but we can change the actual structure and the setup of how church happens. So if it happens that noise is bouncing off of somewhere and it's a little louder than we expected, we can put things in place so that that doesn't happen. Or we can shift so that we can see a little bit different. So not only is it about our changing our expectations or our behaviors, but we can change our physical space. There's lots of things that we could be doing.
I'm not saying the sermon was their favorite part necessarily.
Yeah, I'll add to that about my own experience growing up. I was not the daughter of the pastor, but I was the daughter of the Saturday afternoon pianist. So what happened is I was either sitting up by my mom in the choir loft watching her play piano, or I was sitting by myself down in the front of the church. And some of my memories are that I loved watching my mom play piano. It was really cool. I could see what her hands were doing. I could hear. There were vibrations from the music that I could feel in my body. My other memory is sitting by myself in the front, and I had sisters, and we were chattering, as young people do. Our pastor stopped the sermon and told us to be quiet. And I remember being embarrassed. I remember my mom was embarrassed. I have no idea what the sermon was about. But I was just a young person trying to figure out and navigate church. Kind of at that in-between age where maybe you're too young or too old to go to the nursery, but your brain is not ready to sit still and be quiet for an hour. I was checking my developmental expectations last night, and one thing stood out to me from one of my favorite resources, that around age 5 is when young people can pay attention for about 5 to 10 minutes of an activity. Right? So we have lots of 5 to 10 minute segments throughout church, and there's going to need to be a little bit more changing and attention grabbing for our young people. So I would invite us to think about what we can build in for these little members of our congregation so that they can be participating. They'll start learning things, the Lord's Prayer, is that something that they can engage in? Maybe they're not singers because they can't read the words yet, but can they dance? Can they clap? Can they celebrate? I was telling Pastor Ann some of my most formative faith experiences growing up were going to Lutheran summer camp, and we sang a song there that says, when you worship God, you do more than sing. When you worship God, you do everything. And so I encourage us to think about, like, what is that everything that we could bring into our worship space so that our young people learn what worship truly is for them. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm Laura's mom and proud of her. Church from Germantown. But I've only been near the playground 2 times. And the first time, as a grandma, you're looking and I'm watching one of my grandsons hoard all the quiet blocks, and I'm just thinking, please, Lord, he'll learn to share. And he did learn to share, because we had a little talk, and I'm sure Laura had a talk, but I didn't even, see him hoarding all the stuffed animals and all the blocks. So sharing got learned, and today I sat more away from the edge, leaving the edge to a young mom, but I was so excited the first day to be there. But it was just a joy for grandma that her kids and family were there, and so I can only imagine it getting better and better, and I try to back into the middle and not pay too much attention, you know what I mean? So it's learning for everybody, but you got a crayon and so did Beth Brown, because I go, Beth, I know you can handle that, but it was just, to me, it's great. And I saw 5 little faces turn when those Bibles were being distributed. 5 little faces turned. And when they were hearing, and did you see all the families where the other children were hugging their parents? To me, this is why this church is great. There's just a lot of hugging and participation, and there's dads and moms. It's a good thing. It's a good thing.
As a parent who is a bit outside of the playground, so I have a 4 and a 6-year-old who are in that 5 to 10 minute range currently. But I think even just having this space as a person who walked in almost becoming a member of St. Matthew's, just seeing the fact that you welcome that would mean something to me. Because I remember sitting with my young kids and hoping that somebody else screamed before my kids did. Like, I remember sitting there like, do not let them be the loudest first. Like, they can be second, just don't let them be first. But it's welcoming. I think it's welcoming for new members. I think it's welcoming for new families. Even just having this space, let alone having kids, and walking in every week these last 2 weeks and seeing that full has brought joy to me. And you all, I think the gentleman over there was talking about his, bringing his kids and having them sit. You all help my kids learn how to sit in church. Because I will whisper to them when they're not whispering, and today was not a whisper day, and I will whisper, and I said, look around. Do you see everybody else? And you teach them how to be in there, and it's hard, and I feel bad if they're disrupting you all, but you all help me so much. So thank you very much.
Is there any historic precedent for how children would fit into the worship? Because I was involved in a situation a long time ago on our Board of Education where something people thought it was innovative, and we look back and it was done like in 300 AD in the ancient church. And we said, we're very conservative. We're going back to the way it really was done. Well, in this case, is there any historic precedent, even in the ancient synagogue or the ancient church, of how children fit into any sort of formal worship?
That is a really good question.
The thing Pastor Karen. I won't speak towards worship, but I will speak towards humans in general, that the idea that we sit and be still is, in the realm of human history, a more new thing. If you think about ancient peoples who are out running around to hunt and gather and live, that is what our bodies were designed to do. That's what our minds were designed to do. And we don't do that anymore. So there is a need for even us as grown-ups to be active in our lives, and that you might notice if you sit for 8 hours a day, it doesn't really feel good at the end of it. That's not really how we're built as people. So I'm sure that has played a part in religion over time, but I don't know the history of that.
Not to put you on the spot, but even if you have time to think about it, if you have any ideas of a succinct way, what we should say to our children before going to the playground that might help, this is what we're gonna do with our senses, I can think of these things too, but I don't know little people's brains very well, so anything like that, or if they reinforce it in Sunday school, might be helpful.
Yeah.
Just what are some, things, goals for them.
So I was reading about other congregations and what they have done with playground spaces.
one of the suggestions was making kind of a community agreement so that all of the people in the congregation can kind of reinforce the same messages to our young people. I can think on that a little bit more. Thinking about like our 3-year-olds, they can take in about 2 or 3 steps at a time. So if in the middle of service, we're trying to give a long explanation about in the worship space we're quiet and this is why, they're probably not gonna get it. But there are probably some simpler phrases or reminders that we can try to use as a community and see how that feels good. I would really be interested from all of you parents, whether recent parents or longtime parents, what has worked well for you, and then maybe we can blend that together with some child development pieces and make it work.
I have a question. When you envisioned this group, did you have an age limit in your mind?
We talked about that and decided not to put an age limit on it, in part because there's lots of little kids who have older siblings, right? And that parents are probably best suited to knowing what's best for their child. But also we thought Beth, where did Beth go? She had to go to choir thing. That we didn't want to put age limitations on it because perhaps there would be kids with special needs or their brains work in a different way, and that we didn't neurodivergent, and we didn't want to exclude kids who might benefit from that space. I passed around, I hope all of you got this. I thought I'd go through it really quickly, and my guess is that it will spark some more questions for you and for Laura. So these are just some of the things that we were thinking about as we were thinking about a playground. The first is just a fact. Birth to age 3, a child's brain is developing at a rate of 1 million neural connections per second. So that's amazing to me. That's a miracle to me. And those connections are strengthened through repeated positive experiences. So church worship could be one of those repeated positive experiences. Toddlers are able to learn a new action from observing completely unfamiliar strangers. So you don't have to be the parent or the caregiver to help a child learn something. They can observe someone they're not familiar with at all, and you can help their brains grow. So when you sit, stand, pray, and sing in church, you are helping to teach very young children how to worship. Okay. Here's a question, but don't we have a nursery? Yes, we have a nursery, and parents are welcome to use that nursery at any time. But one of the ways children learn how to be in church is by being in church. Children experience worship with all of their senses, and the rest of us do too. Even when it looks like they are not paying perfect attention, they're picking up sights, smells, sounds, and this way kids can be cared for and absorb as much of the worship service as possible. You can't do that in the nursery, right? One of the things we heard after the first Sunday of the playground was, well, it doesn't look like they're praying in there, right? It does look like a playground. It doesn't look like a playground. Kids, and if you have ever spent any time with a kid, you know they are listening when you don't think they're listening, right? They're doing something else, and it looks like they're not paying attention, and they are taking it all in, right? I told this story to my Bible study class, but I'll tell it to you as well. When my kids were little, it was either Monday, Thursday, or Good Friday. My son Simon was laying down in the pew coloring, And my husband was giving the sermon and but first he read the scripture. It was the scripture where Jesus says to Simon Peter, have you fallen asleep? Right? Because he told them to stay awake in the Garden of Gethsemane. And he says, stay awake and pray with me. And then Jesus leaves and goes and prays, and he comes back and all the disciples are asleep. But the line in the Bible is, Simon, are you sleeping? Right? So my husband is reading this out of the Bible. Simon, are you sleeping? And my kid, who's coloring, right, and I think he's not paying attention to anything, in the middle of the worship service, stands up on his pew and he says, I'm not sleeping, Daddy. Right? So he was listening. He was learning. He was taking it in. It sure didn't look like it, but he let us know that he was learning. So if you look over there and you see kids that they're just playing and they're not doing a whole lot of praying, I'm trying to think about a way to say this nicely, and I can't. That learning is happening whether you can see it or not, okay? What happens when we need seating in that area? This is one of the things the staff discussed. Well, what about Christmas Eve, when we kind of need all the chairs that we have? We can bring them back. One of the wonderful things about St. Matthew's is that we don't have pews that are like fixed to the floor. The chairs can be moved. On Christmas Eve or on Easter morning, we can roll up that rug, put it somewhere else, and bring the chairs back. It's a flexible space. What if this is distracting to me? The answer is, it probably will be. It's probably going to be distracting. Kids make noise, drop things, and move around, and so do the rest of y'all. We all do that. Have you ever heard a phone ring in the middle of a worship service? Anybody?
Remember those silver alerts?
Silver alert? Have you ever heard a person whose hearing maybe isn't that great whisper to the person next to them, but it's not a whisper at that point? It's like really, really loud. Anybody ever been distracted by that? Anybody ever seen somebody have, like, several months ago, someone like collapsed in the center aisle right before worship started, right? Like, there's lots of distractions because it's a group of people gathered together, and that's just how that works. The liturgy is full of movement and sound. We share the peace, we receive communion. There's choirs that sing, there are ringers that ring. There are people who cough and sneeze. And being welcome at St. Matthew's does not depend on your ability to behave. Good thing, right? It doesn't depend on your ability to be quiet or your ability to behave. I was going to say something else about that and I forgot. Okay. So, and this is something Beth brought up before about maybe people whose brains work differently or have different abilities. Do you all know Julia Murphy? Her brother Norman does he have Down syndrome? He has Down syndrome. You've probably heard Norman in worship because he'll say the Lord's Prayer, but he'll say it about a half a measure behind everybody else. So we say Amen, and then you can hear him speaking, and then you hear his Amen after everybody else is done. Are we going to tell Norman he can't come to worship? Never, right? So there's just all kinds of different people, all kinds of different abilities, and this is what it means to be the body of Christ, right? That we love and support and care for all people at whatever age they are, at whatever stage they are. And we accommodate all kinds of needs in worship. We arrange furniture for people who come in with walkers or wheelchairs. We deliver communion to people who don't want to walk up to receive it. We go to them. We provide large print bulletins. Did you know that? Every worship service, there are large print bulletins available for people. We have hearing devices that you can wear if the sound system isn't good enough for you. Have you used that, Judy? The hearing devices?
I have,
Yeah.
but sometimes it's not working.
Sometimes it's not working. Oh, man. We have quiet sacks for some of the older children that have coloring books and books in them. We serve both wine and grape juice, right? Not just for kids, but for people who, for whatever reason, don't want to have alcohol. We project responses and music on screens and have it in your bulletin. So this is just one more way that we're trying to make everybody welcome at St. Matthew's. We do all those things already, and this is just one more. And I will say, I have been told several times at St. Matthew's by older people that they love the sound of your children in worship, which is hard to believe because you're like mortified when they make noise or they don't behave or whatever. But I've heard people say, my goodness, I would rather that than no children at all, right? So I hope Christine and Laura, some of the other parents here can know that as well. That people, you know, even when they look over and you're like, oh, here it goes. I'm about to be judged, or someone's disapproving of me or of my parenting. What it really is probably somebody going, oh, isn't that kid so cute? And I'm so glad they're here. So are there any other questions after reading this put together? Anything else? Yeah, Robert.
Not really a question, more just a comment. I think it's been super cool the last couple weeks seeing parents come in that maybe didn't read the bulletin or didn't see the signs, and just seeing a sense of relief when they go, oh, did you see that carpet space? Because I think anybody who's been a parent or frankly interacted with anybody knows that when you're stressed out, it stresses other people out. So if our parents are coming to church with little kids and they're super stressed about it because they're trying to get them to behave, it's not going to help the kids behave. So having the ability to have parents and caregivers who are bringing kids to church take a deep breath and a sigh of relief, I think is helping the kids behave better.
Yeah, that you're not so wound up so tight about how your kids are behaving, right? And you probably get more out of the worship service that way yourself, right? Anything else that you want to ask Laura, or that perhaps some of these things have brought up for you? Do you have your own stories of how terrible your kids were in church? Do you want to say, it's okay that your kids make noise? Keep bringing them to church. What do you want to say?
Our church was an old, long church with many pews, and Danny was 3, our son, who's now 33, and all of a sudden he's gone. And I knew he was doing the GI crawl underneath all the way up, and I didn't know where he'd come up. But most of the time, growing up would stand up and send him back. But it was just like, I'm so glad. We did have a crying room, we called it, in the back of the church that was soundproof with glass. But just think of that, I always called it the crying room. I mean, that's not that joyful the more I think about it. The parade ground sounds better than a crying room.
So one thing I'm curious from all of you, a little more brain information for you, is that change, even really exciting change, can activate our brain's stress and threat response. So there may be a friend or a neighbor of yours who is not here today and is like, did you see that? Like this is making me feel uncertain. This is making me feel like things are different and things are changing. We have Bibles in the pew now. That's new. That's different. This can be a challenge for some folks. So, thinking as people who are sitting in this room today, or maybe you've had these conversations, what do you need, or what do you think your neighbors may need to be successful with this change?
Grace.
Grace! My favorite. Yeah. Go ahead.
As an older adult who finds children very distracting in church, as an older adult, I would just as soon have it quiet. However, as a Christian, I realize we are one generation away from disappearing. So therefore, if we don't welcome the kids and the next generation, we're gone anyway.
Yeah.
Yes.
That long-term view.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. What else might you need?
I don't know, for the same reason that young parents want a playground, maybe there's one chunk of the church that could be for quiet. I mean, where no kids would sit. I mean, I don't, small, but.
And that leads me to my thought that, like, yes, change is hard for everybody, right? And a lot of times people have sat in the same place in church for decades, and they are now near all of this chaos, and they might feel like, oh gosh, I've been displaced from my favorite place to sit, and they, you know, probably the best thing for them to do is to find a different place in church if they want a little bit more quiet. But yes, change is hard, and how do we help people find a new favorite spot within the sanctuary?
I just moved across the aisle.
If I just add on to what Bridget was saying, it would, when our girls were young, we sat in the area in front of the choir. So we could make a very quick exit down the back stairs if needed. And what we realized was we were still sitting there out of habit. Our girls were older, they were handling the worship, but there were other little kids who were really beginning to distract us. And we finally just shook our heads and said, well, why don't we sit back in the center section? And we did. And Pastor Gary walked down to us and said, is everything okay? So yeah, change is hard, but we can do it. we can change. It's easy.
It's not easy, but we can.
We can. If we tell ourselves that it's easy, we can do it.
And sometimes I find change is a little bit easier if it's changed for a really good reason. Nobody's wanting to just change things up just to make things different or to make things loud or to kick people out of their favorite seat. Like, it's happening for welcome, right? And to me, that's like a real good reason to make a change. Like you said, like, maybe I don't like it, but as a Christian person, I can see that this is a necessary change.
I was thinking Julie's question, were we putting some parameters around the playground, and just talking with Christine, I think we went philosophically with, we don't tell anyone where to sit when you come to worship. But at the same time, there are all these unspoken habits that which you're referring to that we're aware of. And Carrie, I just thank you. I'm hearing your challenge to at least continue to communicate the why behind this. So I think we'll move forward with some of those thoughts to either in writing or at least in verbal announcements as we welcome people to worship, to say what's going on over here. I think we can keep adjusting, but that's the spot on question, really, Laura, just how are we all adjusting to the changes.
And maybe part of it is the permission to say something or to ask a question or to know that it's an experiment, right? If we find that there's a better spot in the sanctuary to do this, we can move it. We can learn and adapt as we go along. So it's okay to get feedback right? It's okay to say, I miss my favorite seat in the sanctuary, or this is a little too loud. Is there a better place acoustically that we could set this up, right? So it's an experiment, and maybe you can help people know that it's okay to give us some feedback.
I'm speaking as a pastor's wife who sat with 2 children in services. And we had our Sunday bags that we took. And I always sat 2 or 3 rows from the back near a door. And I had never planned to go out that door. But it worked because they could see. But I'm asking myself now in relationship to this new change, since you have it there, would it not be smart in worship for the pastor to, at some point during the service, to walk over to this group and recognize them and have them stand up or whatever they do and give a hallelujah or something, to give them a part in the worship. Maybe during the offering, or certainly not during one of John's renditions. But I mean, let them be seen.
Yeah, absolutely.
In a structured way.
Yes. I think of the word inclusion.
Yeah.
And being present doesn't necessarily mean you're included. And so I think as we continue to get feedback and go on the journey, we might want to ask ourselves, are we including people in worship? That could be kids, that could be many other folks that come in. But what does that look like?
Or have a pastor say a prayer over them that they will be very quiet.
I pray that over all of I'm about to preach now.
To build on that, I don't know when it was, a few weeks ago, we had a baptism and Pastor Ann invited any kids who were in the worship to come up closer to watch. That was something when my kids were little, they wanted to watch when a baptism was happening. So to be able to have them there and close and whatever so that they could see what was going on, that's so important.
Did I see your hand in the back? Did you have a hand?
2 things. I loved your word experiment, and I think it could be a hospitality experiment for the littles, but we were just talking when you said that about a pastor going over to the carpet. I don't know how often we do children's sermons, but that was such a great thing when our kids were growing up, and they weren't real big, and they didn't all have props, but they were just another time to feel included up at the front. So I maybe I haven't been at church a lot this summer, so maybe they went on, but I think and maybe it doesn't have to be a pastor who does it, you could recruit.
Are you volunteering?
I would do that. I'd like a little guidance. I would have fun doing that.
Is it okay if I close? Or do
Yeah.
I want to say? Okay. This morning I was reading, thinking about a verse that really stands out to me. It's from Ecclesiastes, I think 3. Don't quote me on that. You can fact check me if you want. But there's a time and place for everything, for every season under heaven. And I took that to heart about what is the time for our 2-year-olds? What is the place for our 2-year-olds? What is their space in their lifespan, and what is it that they need? And so I just challenge you to think about the time that you might be in your life and the time that other people are in, and what is it that we all need in this season of our faith together. Thanks.
Yes, no, I know. I saw you talking. I was like, oh, that's